This episode of Reasonably Spontaneous Conversation is brought to you by In Search of the New Compassionate Male. For more information, go to newcompassionatemale.com.
Hello world, it's me, Dennis, and welcome to a Reasonably Spontaneous Conversation, a very special edition because back in 1979, I was doing this teeny tiny cable access show from the Theta Cable Studios, and I was fortunate enough to have a number of television personalities, but Danny Arnold, who was a Hollywood icon, who produced many shows, including Bewitched and That Girl, and coming up at that time, one of my favorite shows was Barney Miller. And he came on the show to talk about his life and his experience. And here is a clip from that show.
A strange thing happens. You suddenly become very conscious, of life and the things around you that you've sort of taken for granted and haven't paid any attention to. My children grew up suddenly. My kids used to have their birthdays in studio commissaries. I remember my children, if I wanted to see them, my wife had to bring them to the studio. I always left in the morning before they got up, and I never got home till long after they were in bed. And suddenly, from two little pink, chubby 4 and 5 year olds, I looked around, and my one son was 200 pounds and almost 6 feet tall, and my other one just right behind him. And I realized that we didn't even know each other very well.
Who they were, these were entire human beings that have their own distinct individuality and personalities.
Sure. Grew up behind my back, as it were. Yeah.
And now joining me are those two sons Dan and David Arnold.
Hi, Dan.
Welcome. To have your father talk about you that way. This was done on May the 29th, 1979. What was going on with the two of you at that time? Where were you in chronologically?
Chronologically, I was 15 years old in high school, and it was at the height of Barney Miller. He had just had his heart surgery a few months prior, and
that was a quadruple bypass, right?
Yeah, it was the quadruple bypass, and it was a scary time. There weren't very many of those surgeries going on like it is today with the medical advancements that we see, and so it was quite a scary time. We had the surgery in late February, so he was only a few months out of surgery, and we were just kind of starting to get back into some kind of normalcy in life at that time. And like I said, I was just in high school at that time, about 15.
15. And Dan, you were.
Yeah, go ahead.
And you are how much younger than David?
So Dave and I are 13 months apart. I was born in July 64, and Dave was June 63.
Great.
So, it was summer, and I think I'd just gotten out of junior high school then. I think, Dave, I think you were going to be in your high school then, or first, was it? But
no, I think it was about my first year or so.
High school. Yeah.
And Dan, did y'all's relationship with him change after the heart surgery? Did you notice a shift in him? Were you able to get? This was still, of course, in the middle of the show, so he still had all the responsibilities of this. So, what was your experience of having him? He was telling you his experience. What was your experience growing up, watching him from the outside?
I think there was probably. I remember distinctly one or two arguments maybe that we had in the house where he acknowledged the fact after that he was feeling that way, that he acknowledged that we had not spent a lot of time together. And then I think probably after that, even though he was still working a lot, there was maybe a little bit more of a conscious effort to spend time when we would go away, and we would go away for long periods of time during the summer as a family. And we would, I think because of that fact, we would always go on vacation with my parents. And we would go on vacation with our parents, even with my parents' friends who would not take their kids, but we were always with ours. So I think there was a conscious effort to make sure that he tried to make up for that time when he was working on, when he was on hiatus, that we would all go away together as a family.
Did y'all have a sense that you were in part of television royalty? I mean, because the people that your father worked with, the Gelbarts, and you were showing me, Dan, a picture of your father with Jack Lemmon. And so did you guys understand that you were part of the Hollywood, this Hollywood scene was just normal for you? What was that experience like, David?
It was, we had absolutely no clue. And thankfully so. And I think that's in part to my father's personality, the way that he raised us from afar, so to speak, in those formative years. And certainly to my mother, who was so unaffected by the Hollywood scene and glamour that it just translated to our upbringing. And we had no clue. And thinking about it now, when we go back and we talk to friends or some of us that ask us that very question, when we start relating these stories of the things that we have done and the people that we've met, it's only then when you realize,
Jesus.
Yeah, we're you're sitting across the table from Cary Grant and you're making jokes at the racetrack kind of thing, or Mervyn LeRoy. Talk about names from the past. And I had no clue who these people were. And like I said, it really didn't become apparent until the later years when you really talk to people about it. And like we're doing with you now, I think back about things. I'm like, what were we thinking? And we had no idea. And it had to do with my father and my mother. They were not going to allow us to be those kids. Yeah. Not at all. Yeah, no.
Dan, tell me a little about your mother, because your father didn't talk a lot about her. I didn't get a chance to dig in more into that. But could you tell me a little bit about about how she dealt with this situation and being the primary caregiver?
Well, my mom was not a stranger to entertainment. She grew up wanting to be a singer and a dancer, which she did. And
tell us her name.
Donna Cook was
Donna Cook. Thank you.
Her professional name, and she was in acting classes and singing and dancing classes from the time she was a very, very little girl. And I'm going to do the best I can to talk about my mom, because we just lost my mom recently.
Bless your heart.
Try not to get emotional. But so, my mom, she appeared in Little Rascals, and then she kept singing and dancing, and she was one of the top 20 singers and dancers on the Tennessee Ernie Ford show. And that's how our parents met. She was one of the girls in the top 20. My dad was producing Tennessee Ernie Ford for a while, and they met and eventually married. And then my mom left the business when they decided to raise a family, when my brother was born. So she was no stranger to the industry. So she was very unaffected by it. She had kind of been there and understood it. And it was just, I don't know, it was just a normal kind of thing. If my parents, if my dad was a butcher and my mom was working as a checkout girl, it was just a regular life for us. Right. It just happened to be what they did. Yeah. So she was extremely supportive of my dad and what he was doing because she understood it.
This is now during this time there were there was a big lawsuit that your father was involved in. Did he talk about that at all? Because it was a lawsuit with the network and rights and all the work that was that was going on. Was this brought home? Did you guys talk about this, or did
I was going to say, which lawsuit?
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, that was, but because that was part of the process about securing rights and getting them all in distribution and all. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, it was a whole. It was a big deal back then with syndication and how they sold the rights and so on. He didn't bring those things home. He certainly didn't talk about them. He had a tough time hiding his feelings about things, and if you were upset or something that had happened during the course of his day, he would bring that home. But he certainly didn't sit down and said, "Family, we're in a lawsuit, and I want to explain the ins and outs of it." We had no idea. And again, it was really, I don't know if you would say it was shielding or if it was the type of person that he was, but it wasn't for us to really know about. It was more of, hey, something's going on, and you support Pop, and Mom's there is going to take us to school and pack our lunch kind of thing, and then we move on in our lives. And it wasn't, like I said, until later on when the relationship changed and we got older that we would discuss some of these things, especially when I started working for him. You always heard about these things, or I wanted to know about them, and I'd ask,
right,
can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about that? But no, he didn't really. That wasn't something he did. In the early years of Barney, when the show wasn't as popular as it eventually became, those were some thin times. And the old joke was, he came home and he said, "Sell the kids. We got to put another show on the air." And we weren't aware of those kinds of things. He didn't want us to be, nervous about it, scared about it. Pop had everything under control, so to speak.
Well, he wanted to put everything into the show. I mean, it was very obvious that he was talking about that. Dan, do you remember, or David, did he talk about, because on the show he was talking about that he was kind of a rough kid, that he had some rough, when he was a child. Did he talk about his childhood stories with you guys?
Yeah, some. I mean, he was a Depression kid. And I think part of the reason why my dad would discuss a lot of that was because he didn't want us to be affected by his success at all. So we were very aware of how he grew up as a Depression kid, and how he had to sometimes maybe steal an apple off a cart in the Bronx, New York, growing up with nothing. His mom was a nurse working at night. He lost his father, our grandfather, who we never met, very early, and he was in the war at 17 years old. So, he did share some of those stories with us, and always wanted to make us aware that, success just didn't come without hard work. And, he was very grounded in that way.
Did you both, were there discussions on whether or not you were going to follow him? I mean, when we're talking about 4D Productions, right? That's the four of you, right? That's Donna, yeah, right, and Danny and Dan and David, right? That's so. Right. Was this to be the family business? Was it talked about that way? How did you guys look at it at that way? And of course, we're teenagers, or we're hormonal, and we have all this, so we figure out what we're going to be doing. What was the dynamics like?
Well, 4D was started long before Dan and I had a lot of independent thinking going on. When he talks about this chubby 4 and 5 year old children that he has at home, is about the time, maybe a little earlier, that 4D, the inception of 4D became productions and so on. was never. The one thing about my father was, no, he was not insistent that you're going to follow me into the business. This is going to all be yours. This is what you're going to deal with. And he was very supportive in the things that we wanted to do if there was something outside of the lines, so to speak, as far as television and film. His thing with us was, whatever you decide to do, try to be the best at it and actually be the best at it, work hard. But for 4D being what it was, there was no preconceived notion that we were going into the business. Not at all.
We both did eventually.
Yeah, but in fact, it was kind of a strange thing. It was almost, if that was something that we decided to do, he would do his best to try to help us get in, and then the rest was up to us. But he almost kind of discouraged it in a way, because it cost him so much that was something that he didn't want for us to have to experience, because we had already experienced it from 14, 15 years old, watching him do the show, have his emotions so high and eventually cause him a heart attack, and then eventually have the surgery, which obviously affected us greatly. So it was almost this catch 2020, this catch 22 rather, in the sense that I'd love to have you go in the business, but at the same time, I don't want you to hurt yourself. And if we were anything like him, we would hurt ourselves.
Yeah.
So,
I think that he.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
He was definitely more supportive in a production role than he was in a front of the camera role. I grew up wanting to be an actor. I mean, that's all I wanted to do. I was in drama in high school, and I was in acting classes all over LA, and then eventually in New York. And he very, very begrudgingly supported me as an actor, but was verbal about not really wanting me to be an actor. Because he just saw all the heartache that came with it. But he let me go as far as I could. And, it's a really, really tough road, as trying to make a career in front of the camera. And, I don't think he ever really truly supported that. I think that he was in some ways more supportive when we worked behind the camera and when Dave worked behind the camera. But yeah, he knew how painful a career in front of the camera could be. And I don't think he really ever wanted that for me. But I had to beat myself up really badly for a number of years before I understood that.
The creative process as a producer, because I've gotten a chance to produce television over the years, and there's something so satisfying about seeing a production that goes from concept to completion, and you see a show out there that still holds after a number of years, which is what all of the shows that your father was involved in continue to hold up. Those principles, the fact that I care about all of the characters. I mean, that's something that is, I watch some of the superhero action movies and I go, great, wonderful special effects. I read it, but I don't care. Right. But the thing that any of the work that I see with your father and your father's stuff is that he made me care. That was the principal role. I care about that. Like he was talking about casting Hal Linden. You better fall in love with him, because if you don't fall in love with him, we're lost.
He's absolutely right. It's funny with the Barney cast. He knew so well how and why people would eventually come to care about these characters, because somewhere inside all of us is one of those guys.
Yes.
And each one of those characters was a portion of my father's personality. They're every single one of them. When I watch the show, I'm like, oh, sure, I've heard that from Dad. I remember this, and he's done that. and eventually, like I said, every one of us has a portion of that personality. So the minute that you recognize yourself in one of these characters, that's when this relationship formed. And it took a little bit, but once people did, they latched on to an individual character. And once they latched on to an individual character, well, then they wanted to know why the relationship that they're watching is doing so well with Levitt or, with Wojo. And so people started to recognize themselves within the show. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was a great success. My father's insight to what people like and what they would be attracted to was pretty amazing, even today, so many years later. And one of the major things, of course, outside of being my father as well, is one of his personality traits when we would talk that I sorely miss.
Yeah, not only that, if you look at the time when the show started in, the 70s, I mean, there really weren't any shows that were diversified like the detective room of Captain Barney Miller's office, and that also was a testament to my father and how he thought. I mean, he loved everybody, and he didn't care who you were or what color you were or what your background was. If you had talent and you worked hard and you had something to contribute, he didn't care who you were. And he brought that forth in his show. I mean, he had Barney Miller's one of the first shows to air gay characters, black characters.
Exactly.
And I think that was also another tribute to the show and how well it was received, is because, like my brother said, people could see themselves in that show. If you were black, you could see yourself in that show because there was a black detective, there was a Japanese detective, there was a Polish detective. There was such diversification there that everyone had an opportunity to see someone that represented them in that detective room as a successful, upstanding member of society working as a police detective. It was a first. That was groundbreaking.
Stunning. And he humanized the people that were arrested. So they were not
exactly right.
You were a standard bad person or person. They were this is a person who was something happened to on their worst day, and he would constantly bring that in and bring that as their own personalities. And it's stunning to be able to have that together.
Well, listen, growing up in the Depression, when you don't have 2 pennies to rub together, you understand why sometimes good people have to bend the rules a little bit to get by. It was never an excuse, but it was an understanding.
Do either of you remember, because I never got a chance to ask him this question, but before, how the idea for this show developed in his mind before it ever got down to the page or pitched to the network or done anything, that the early germ of that idea, when it was just at that early level, I don't know the story.
I don't know that I know the story either. Maybe David has some insight there.
David, did you?
Well, I know that in talking to him over the years, the germ of it, no, I couldn't tell you. I can only tell you that the set, the location, the set, the personalities, those were all things that he experienced in his lifetime. That detective room was a room that he had been in as a kid at some point in his life, for whatever the reason may be. It was all a reflection of and a sum total of his experiences at that time that went into the show, and how he saw it. Back east, having detective rooms like that are very prevalent. Out here on the West Coast, that's not so much. But everything was about his experiences, and eventually it changed to only being in the precinct room. That was in the detective room. At the very beginning, it was the life and times. Partially at home and his family, and partially in at the at Barney's office, which didn't seem to work at the end, as we know. But again, those things that happened in the early years, when as it was the life and times, were things that happened at home. I mean, one of the characters, the son in one of the early shows was named David. Well, everything David picked up, he'd pick up and pretend it was a gun and go bang. Well, that was in the show. It's because I did that. So everything that he was a part of was always something that he knew quite well. It was something he experienced. It was nothing that he grabbed out of the air most of the time.
Yeah. Well, he always said that the best writers write what they know.
Yeah.
Credibility.
Yeah, credibility.
I loved it because when I was rewatching the show with Renee yesterday, our director, and we were preparing for the show, and I said this wonderful statement. And now you're part of television, the greatest communications medium that has ever been in the history. And I'm going, yeah, okay. So how with the internet and all that, how have you two participated in your production lives? So where give me a little bit of a background into how that influences you and what you guys are doing in your careers.
Well, I could tell you that it's interesting that you ask. Television was exactly what you said at the time, and obviously it's evolved into something completely different on all levels, whether it's Instagram and Facebook and so on. When I started in the business, I started as a runner, and I would clean edit bays, and we were still editing on 3/4 inch tape and mastering on 1 inch when I started. By the time I left there, and I moved into editing before I started in sports, we were working on an Avid system, and it was all digital. In a very short amount of time, a 10-year span, if not less than that.
So now we're nonlinear. You can actually,
correct.
You actually can cut in.
Oh, on my computer at home, my Mac, I have more powerful tools in a tiny little box this size than when I started, and the edit bay had a computer the size of this room, and you punched out a tape for your edit list. I mean, it was archaic. It was the only way that you can really. I mean, I know kids that I work with now, they don't even know what a 3/4 inch tape is. I don't even know if they know what tape is. Everything's digitized. CDs are almost non-existent now that we're moving that far ahead. So it changed during the time that I kind of grew up with it in the business. I've since been out of the business for about 18 years, and social media has a completely different meaning in what I do today. Some of it very good, some of it, debatable.
Yeah, it is. I just went over this, ladies and gentlemen, is a 3/4. This is what it was mastered on. This is what the show was mastered on. And right here, this basic U-matic Scotch. And your father got a copy of it. That was our gift as to each guest. So somewhere in a box, they discover if he still kept it as the original master from his side of this interview.
I will bet you dollars to donuts. I know I can find it. Guaranteed.
That would be wonderful. And so, Dan, did you follow into the business? Did you finish acting and then continue into production?
Yeah, I mean, David got into production long before I did. I was running around, trying to become Johnny Depp with no hair, and that didn't.
I resemble that. I got.
Yeah. At the time, that was before all the Bruce Willises and all the handsome, balding actors out there had made a name for themselves. So that wasn't quite working out too well for me. I had it worked, I would have been the first to be successful to be Johnny Depp. But that did not work. And eventually, after my dad passed, which was in August of '95, my brother and I were kind of like, okay, well, we just lost the biggest influence in our lives. What do we do now? And we took over his company, and we got some projects done and did a lot of development together. But I did some stage managing for a while, and just the business is so difficult to sustain, especially from the creative side. Yeah. And then I tried to, I went into stage managing, tried to bounce into the production side, and that had its pitfalls as well. Everything changed from tape to film, and then the categories and the DGA changed, and you hadn't worked for a while. Now all of a sudden, as a stage manager, I couldn't get hired because I was a tape stage manager and I didn't work in film, and it was a different category and you needed more hours. So it kind of just, after a while, we concentrated on the creative side of just development and trying to sell our own projects. But then after a while, it just, I had a family. I got married in '97, and then shortly after had my first child. And then it just became more about raising a family than it did about sustaining my own personal career goals. And so I got into other things. I tried to do things that were creative, but I got into other things, and subsequently also left the business maybe around the same time David did. But I was buying and selling and flipping real estate, and that was supporting my creative desires to, rehabbing was a great thing because you could still create, and it was still a creative process. So I did that for a while, and then after a while, I wound up leaving that and going into law enforcement like my brother did.
And you, David, what would talk about your journey?
So I worked. I thought I was going to do the photography thing. I'd been into photography since a very young age. My father would hand me his camera, and I would take pictures, and I'd fiddle around. And then I really found a creative outlet for myself, something that I recognized that I could do, capture moments in time the way I liked it. And I kind of started down that path. When it was time for me to go to college, UCLA only had some theory classes. USC was not even close to being built in any way, shape, or form. There was nothing there.
Goodness.
Ironically, in the early 80s, there was a community college in Los Angeles City College, and they had 2 or 3 working television studios and about 10 film edit bays. And they were the predecessor to what USC eventually became. One of my father's close associates, kid, went to LACC, and he was telling me about it. And I'm like, Los Angeles? Who goes to Los Angeles City College? So I took a tour. I looked at the studios, and I felt at home immediately. Took a few photography classes. I didn't like anybody telling me what I had to take a picture of, and that ended my photo career as a professional right there. And I went into the television department there, and I had a successful career at the college for a couple of years. I made some commercials and things as part of our assignments that they used for several years after as examples of what you should be doing. And I didn't realize it until I actually stepped on the stage and that this was what I was supposed to do. So I went to my father
in those commercials, by the way. So just to go to show you how my career was going.
There you go.
We didn't need a balding Bruce Willis at the time. So it just became this kind of natural thing that I fell into at City College. So when I announced to my father that I wanted to be in the business, and, you know, knowing who he was at the time and what he was doing and working on, this was just before Barney went off the air. I had these delusions of grandeur. Well, I'm going to go work on a series and I'm going to do this because look what I did here at LACZ. Of course, it'll all translate into my profession. And my dad said, yeah, that's great. I want you to go down to La Brea to the editing bay, and I want you to learn how to sweep the floors and get people lunch. And then you'll discover what a machine is and what tape is, and you'll be starting at the bottom. And I said, okay, thank you. And he goes, that's how you learn what you're doing. He goes, I could easily make a few calls and put you in some executive position at a studio, and you'd know absolutely nothing about what you're doing. You'd make a fool out of yourself, and you wouldn't last long, and you wouldn't feel good about yourself at the end of the day. Trust me. And I was like, son of a, all right. So I went, and that's what I did. I started sweeping edit bays and kind of taught myself how to edit. It was this was when MTV had just come up, and everybody was, and their mother was doing music videos, and people that were actors were becoming music video directors. And I was in the middle of all of that. And I eventually taught myself how to edit, became an editor, put myself through school at different video companies in LA, learning how to use the Avid system, and I became an editor. And then I transitioned out of that into sports production. And I did sports production for several years. And then my dad sat down and asked me what I wanted to do, and I told him that I wanted to stay in production. And he said, okay, I got this thing that may be going. I think I may want to have you come work with me. Let me see your resume. That's really literally what happened. And I had to show him what I had accomplished, who I'd worked for, what I had done. And I laughed, and I'm like, he goes, no, this is an interview, kid. You're not getting anything, nothing for free here. I need people that are going to work, not just stand around and say, hey, I'm Danny's kid. Which proved to be difficult, not only in doing the job, but knowing that you're Danny's kid and you're working on the show. I had to work that much harder
Absolutely.
to prove that I belonged there. So I quickly understood how someone's health could decline, having that kind of pressure put on yourself, because I am my father's son. Mm-hmm. And I did that for a while. We worked together up until his death. And then Dan and I worked on a few things, and then I'd had about enough. And I had a different calling.
Into law enforcement.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was something inside me that I really, Dan had been involved in law enforcement, and I'd asked him about it, and that's when I got involved. There was something inside of me that felt that although this fantasy world of doing television and film was great, you were still in this kind of this fantasy life, and there was real life that was going on right outside the window. And there was something inside me that said, you know, I think I can do more. I think I could do better. I'm not sure that this is the path. I want to try it. And it came very naturally to me, that kind of, you know, helping people in a different way. And outside of making them laugh, I could probably do something in with real life tragedy and try to involve myself in that. Kind of sounds a little noble and silly, but it's a strange feeling you have inside, especially where we come from.
Yeah.
And
but it's a calling. I mean, we all, every one of our souls responds to a calling, responds to some sound that only I can hear. It's whispered to me from the universe, however that works, whatever your metaphor is. And that's the one that I can listen to. I have to get quiet enough I have to get quiet enough and then to be able to hear it. And so this will pull in that direction. So so when you look at 2021 and you look at the law enforcement and how we've become, how the police and law enforcement have become so militarized and come in, and how do you see, because my sense of this is that law enforcement is actually a peace officer, that there is something that the job of the greatest opportunity would be, I would love to go into a police force and go, who is your best de-escalator? Who is the person who can walk into that awful situation and bring the temperature down enough to be, as we saw in Barney Miller over and over and over again, when it was a really tense situation, when they were able to bring it down to where you could then deal with the situation?
You know, I'm asked that question a lot. One of the things that I do for the department that I work for is as a crisis and hostage negotiator. And you have to be able to, anybody has to be able to, in de-escalation. I mean, you don't have to be a cop to understand de-escalation. I mean, you could be you could be a checker at a market and somebody's pissed off that the eggs are broken. And how do you deal with that? And it's a human function. And and that's really all it is. You have to have the right mindset as a police officer. You have to have a strand of emotion as somebody that's emotionally charged, that has the ability to hear what you're saying. And when you get that perfect, not storm, but when you get that perfect situation where what I'm saying makes sense to the person on the other end, is when you can really get something to happen and happen quickly and safely. And it happens, shockingly, people won't believe this, but that happens more times than not. It's only, unfortunately, you were talking about television being the biggest influencer. Now we have all these avenues, and it really depends on what side of the fence people stand on, which is broadcast to the world for their consumption, for them to decide on their own. That's one of the tragedies of today's social media on every level, is that people are feeding it to you how they want you to hear it, instead of giving us the ability to be able to make the decision on our own. What we're looking at is either X or Y. But that happens, that de-escalation and the success of de-escalation without violence happens, you can't pick a number. I could tell you that 99% of situations that call for de-escalation are successful. And it's only the 1%, depending upon who wants you to know about it, broadcast that very small fraction of disheartening situations that even as cops, they're not happy about.
But that skews it, doesn't it? Doesn't it, Dan? I mean, that skews the consciousness of what people think is actually going on, because they are not seeing that 99% of ones that are taken care of. And to be able to celebrate that, what an opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's human nature, right? I mean, nobody causes a traffic jam to watch somebody change a tire, but you'll be in a traffic jam, 10 miles long, because there's a highway patrolman giving someone a ticket.
Yeah.
So it's whatever can be sensationalized, which is why the 0.0001% of situations that happen in law enforcement that are terrible get 100% of the media attention.
Yeah. And that's where I want to change it. I hope we can be part of that change and be able to see the humanity on all parts of this, which again circles back to Barney Miller.
Yeah.
Oh, without a doubt, it comes full circle. And my father said it. It's not being a faceless mob, treating people as individuals. Credibility and accountability are the key to any successful relationship, whether it's with the police and the civilian population, cops and other cops, cops from other departments, cops from other parts of the country and the world, you and I, it's credibility and accountability and being treated as an individual. And it really makes a difference when people look at it that way instead of the obvious eyeball, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people need to realize that, police officers are not grown in a test tube. Police officers are pulled from society. And, as hard as law enforcement tries to weed out the people that they think may not be successful as police officers, unfortunately, just out of human nature, there's going to be one or two problems, but people need to understand that those one or two problems are very, very, very small.
Yes, and that way we can skew it differently. I was doing a fantasy experiment, and I was thinking of when your father was a kid, and you go by Central Park or go by there, and there'd be one person on a soapbox standing there and ranting, and now that same person in 2021 is sitting there with a Facebook feed or a Twitter feed and broadcasting that same information, but broadcasting out to the world. So it changes the dynamics of what they're seeing.
It absolutely does. And again, it's the delivery of the message and from where it comes from.
Yep.
It's unfortunate. I remember watching the news, and you'd watch the news, and Jerry Dunphy back in the day in Los Angeles, everybody, whether you looked at 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, the channels of the day, they were all reporting the same fire in the same way. And it was just a matter of who you were a fan of that you were going to watch how they broadcast this fire. Well, nowadays, it's not the same. And everybody has a different skew and angle on that fire. Oh, well, the fire was set. Oh, no, the fire happened. It's a natural gas leak. No, we think that the such and such group set the fire. Now you look at these 7 different stations and you get 7 different opinions on the same flame. The same flame has 7 different connotations to it, depending upon who you're speaking or watching. It's ridiculous.
And when the whole economics is built upon, if I can keep your eyeball on this page for a fraction of a second longer, I'm going to end up having my business model built on that. So all I can do is to be as salacious and as I possibly can in order to be able to do that. So it requires us to grow up. We as 100%. We as human beings to have critical thinking and all. Now, do you both have children?
Dan has 3. I've got dogs.
You got dogs. Well, do you tell your niece and nephewlings about their grandfather?
Oh, absolutely, all the time.
What are they curious about? What do they think about? Have they watched his shows? Some of the things. What kinds of questions do they have?
We have such pride in our father's accomplishments and who he was and what he did for us. The greatest legacy that we discuss, or at least I discuss with the kids. Great kids, by the way, smart, loving kids. I just tell them how he treated us and how we grew up and what our experiences were, and that the reason why your dad may say X, Y, and Z, or the reason why I may tell you X, Y, and Z, it's because it's what I know and what was successful for us when we were kids growing up, and we had the same kind of questions or were upset about the same kind of things of the day. That's the only really the way that we can, continue our father's
legacy,
so to speak. The way he brought us up, the type of person he was.
And Dan, you got a chance then to spend the father time during those years, and so you got a chance to that's passing the legacy on. It's like an alcoholic gets an opportunity to be able to pass on to his grandchildren to say, these are the lessons that I learned, and so now I'm going to practice this in a different way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything that I've done as a father, I learned from my parents. The good, the bad, you take all of it and then you meld that into your own parenting style. But I credit everything that I do as a parent to how I was raised. And part of that is the time that I spend with my kids that I lost, with my dad. I filled that gap for myself in a lot of ways. But, I credit my parents with that, my upbringing with that. The love and the affection that we got from our parents, I bestowed on my own children. I paid attention a little bit more in some areas because of that interview that you had with my dad, where he had that realization. I also had that realization and wanted to make sure that I didn't have that gap with my own kids, which is why in a lot of ways I didn't just continue to push into a career that was kept slamming doors on me, because I was very cognizant of what my kids were going to need from me as a father. So I made changes in my life so I wouldn't have one day that same interview that my dad had where he felt like he missed on all this time. And I got to tell you that all that came full circle recently, because my son, who I'm extremely proud, proud of all my kids. He just graduated from the University of Alabama, and he just got his first job. He and his girlfriend are moving to Florida, and he was on the phone with my wife the other day, and he was very tearful and very melancholy, telling my wife that, he didn't really want to move away. And one of the reasons he didn't want to move away was because we did such a good job as parents that he didn't want to be away from us. And that to hear that from your son is worth everything that happened between him being born in 1998 and moving away now in 2021. There's nothing more gratifying to hear as a parent that they feel like you have done your job well and prepared them well, and they don't want to leave you. And I think my dad would be extremely proud that those lessons were learned, from his experiences with me. This is truly one of the greatest, regrets of my life, even though I could not change it, is that my dad did not get to meet my kids, because I think, especially because I have two daughters and my parents raising two sons didn't get to experience a granddaughter. In some ways, it's the most tragic thing that ever happened in my life. And in some ways, it's probably a good thing, because my dad would have been such a crazy, amazing grandparent. I don't think I would have had a chance to become a father myself, because I think my dad would have elbowed me out of the way and said, "Look, kid, I got this. I know what I did the first time. I got this the second time." He would have been the most amazing grandfather to ever walk the planet. And that's an unfortunate regret, but obviously there's nothing we could do about it. But I think if he's looking down on us, that he would be very proud of both of us and the choices that we've made, and he'd be very proud of his grandchildren, and that I learned the lessons and fixed some of those very, very minor details of spending time with my kids. So I thank him for that. I mean, he really
that's paying it forward. That's the part of humanity that we can continue on. The cathedral that you can only build. You can only know that you put that block in, knowing you'll never finish the cathedral, but you have that, and you guys have that now. Dan,
I put those stones in for him. I put those bricks in for him.
There you go. Dan, David, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to meet the sons of someone who influenced me so much even before I met him. Certainly, having met him, spending that half hour with him, a half hour that so influenced me along my trajectory and along my path of compassion and making sure that people, in everything that I write or I put, the first thing is that you make sure you better damn well make people care about it, care about the character, care about the thing. And as you do in law enforcement, we know that it's that human element. It's head and heart. It's the combination, and that's what he did. Thank you, Dan, so much for coming. David.
Thank you. He's with us.
You're very welcome, Dennis.
He's with us today, right here on this cashmere coat.
That's sure, yes. And I just want to, that is the jacket. And anyone that sees, and we will put a link to the original interview in there, and you'll see that same jacket is the jacket that Danny was wearing in that interview on May the 29th, 1979.
Yep, he's with us today.
Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
This episode of Reasonably Spontaneous Conversation was brought to you by In Search of the New Compassionate Male. For more information, go to newcompassionatemale.com.